the very start of the pandemic, whereas the movement of asylum seekers in Ireland, we started raising concerns about the way the pandemic would affect people in direct provision centres and asylum seekers in general. As you would know, that travel bans were imposed on many countries around the world, and asylum seekers literally need to travel from one place to the other in search of safety. And so that meant that a lot of people around the world couldn't leave their countries where they were persecuted, so their home countries, if they were in their home countries. It meant that people couldn't go in search of that sanctuary because the main means of traveling were shut down in many parts of the world. And so you saw number of asylum claims being lodged in the country dwindling down. It doesn't mean, of course, that people aren't being persecuted or don't need safety. They do, but it's just that they don't have the means to do so. Then the other way that the pandemic affected people is, of course, the way in which states respond to or receive asylum seekers. In Ireland, we would know that asylum seekers for the last 20 years have been living in direct provision centres or surviving in direct provision centres, where you have a family of 5 in one tiny bedroom, a hotel bedroom, and that hotel bedroom is the only private space that they have as a family together, and every other living space would be shared with other strangers. Capacity in the centers varies from 200 to over 800 in Mosney Direct Provision Center, which is the biggest in the country. And so you can imagine congregated setting of that nature, and you have COVID-19 having to share those intimate living spaces. It becomes very difficult. This would be a similar situation for homeless Irish people who were living in homeless family hubs, they call them. They are set up in exactly the same manner as direct provision centers, but they aren't really for long-term stays, just as direct provision centers aren't for long-term stays. But we know that from experience, asylum seekers spend a long time in direct provision, just as homeless people spend a long time living in hotels, because the Irish state has been very reluctant to build public housing. They abdicate the responsibility to the private sector. For a lot of activists, it became apparent that all the arguments that we have been presenting were actually just needing political will in order to address the challenges that we had been identifying. So we saw people, homeless people in Dublin Regional Homeless Executive being moved into self-contained units, but we didn't see the same measure being taken to move asylum seekers, for instance, from direct provision centers into self-contained units where they wouldn't be sharing bedrooms and bathrooms and other communal spaces, so they could self-isolate when they need to, and they could observe social distancing. That was not done for asylum seekers. And so we saw massive disparities in terms of how the state responded in the provision of material needs, such as housing, such as welfare assistance or payments that were provided. So asylum seekers were initially excluded from getting the pandemic unemployment payment. So if you lost your job as an asylum seeker when the lockdown was imposed, you weren't entitled to claim pandemic unemployment when it was introduced. Only people who were not living in direct provision were allowed to claim that. And so you had a lot of asylum seekers being pushed onto the margins as per normal, even during the COVID-19 pandemic. They only later started to say that we would give asylum seekers the pandemic unemployment when they realized that asylum seekers weren't coming forward for testing for COVID-19, and many of the outbreaks were actually in direct provision centers. And so you would remember the second wave of COVID-19 in Ireland started with meat plants and direct provision centers, where mainly migrants who would be people on the margins of Irish society actually live and work. And so in those circumstances, you see COVID-19 amplified all the social exclusion, economic exclusion that we saw in terms of provision of public goods and services to people. It made it more evident, more salient, if you like, to anybody who cared enough to pay attention. And for us, the only solution to overcome that is to ensure that when we move forward from a post-COVID-19 society, is that we don't leave people behind, that we don't have that kind of exclusion, that we will provide self-contained units for a certain group of people, but leaving others to their own peril. Will provide welfare payments to one group while we exclude another group who are all directly affected by the same phenomena, which is COVID-19. It will be the same with other issues, housing issues that would have been before COVID-19. Those need to be addressed in a manner that is non-discriminatory, because poverty and diseases affects all of us. Particularly COVID-19 shows us that much. You can't move away from COVID-19 pandemic without ensuring that everybody in Ireland is provided with material needs, all the material needs that they would need. For instance, parents who are in direct provision having to homeschool their children. How do you begin to homeschool your children in one bedroom when that one bedroom is the only space that you have as a family? Where is the classroom? Where is the play space? Where is how do you start having a class when other people in the same room aren't in class? Where do you start with class when you don't have a laptop? Can't even afford one. You're getting paid 38.80 euro per week, an allowance. Where do you get a laptop with that amount of money? And so what COVID-19 has shown us is that there are solutions to all the problems that we have faced, and they only require the political will in order to change them, to address them. And that sadly does not happen without changing the narrative, the dominant narrative in public policy discourse. So when a lot of people propose solutions that are inclusive, a lot of the narrative tends to be, no, it's going to be expensive to provide all of these things to everybody else. But COVID-19 tells us that actually it's more costly not to provide public services, public goods and services in an equitable manner to all people in the state. And so for the movement of asylum seekers, the lessons we've learned during the pandemic is that all our struggles matter. Wherever we may be, whether you are a traveler, whether you are an asylum seeker, or whether you are a person from Roma descent, all our pains matter, and all of us are worthy of having that right to dignity and right to equality and equity. All of those, when all of our lives are precious and are cherished, it becomes, as seen as precious and cherished, it becomes easier then to make public policies that are inclusive.